Hey everybody, I'm Sean King. I'm really excited to be a new member of the Young Turks team, and I'm so thankful and grateful for all the well wishes and warm thoughts that you've sent my way when we made the announcement. I'm glad to be a part of the team. For years I've been a huge fan of the Young Turks, and even last year I said, even doing the work that I do, I already really felt like I was a part of the team and really identified with the way we do news here. And so I'm excited to be behind the camera, excited to be a commentator, and to talk with you all about the issues that matter to me and matter to you. You know, we really don't know what 2017 is going to bring us, but I do know that the Young Turks will be coming with hard-hitting news every single day. It's a huge part of why I even felt motivated to join the team. Was I'm deeply concerned about what the future will hold, and wanted to be a part of the community. And the Young Turks, we're not just a news website. We are a community not just of thousands, but of millions of people all across this country and all around the world. And I felt like it was important, even just for me as an individual, to be a part of this team with where our country is going. You know, I say this all around the country, and I wanted to say it to you. You know, it's really hard to understand a moment in history when you're in it. Right now, you're just watching me on a screen at home or on the road, and nothing about this moment feels historic. But we're in a deeply problematic period, not just in American history, but in human history. And it really requires us to stand up against the establishment, against the power structure, and not just against Donald Trump and his administration, but against anybody who is trying to manipulate the system and run over everyday people. And not only that, but one of the things that really endeared me to the Young Turks almost 2 years ago in particular was that sometimes we have to talk about Democrats and even progressives and hold everybody's feet to the fire and hold them accountable. That's a huge part of what we do here. And so even though we're a progressive platform and see the world in a very progressive way, that doesn't mean we don't hold our own leaders accountable. And so we always call it out. And so that's what I do, and that's what I've been doing. That's what the Young Turks does as well. And so,
as Theresa May explains, the case was historic. The case on Massoud, he was not part of the current intelligence picture. Now, was ISIS responsible? And that's a question that's almost always asked in these situations. ISIS claimed responsibility for the attack, referring to Massoud as, quote, a soldier of the militant group, but it was unclear to what extent the organization was involved, Huffington Post reports. Authorities said earlier on Thursday that they believed Massoud was inspired by terrorism abroad, but acted alone. So now they've got different distinctions for, were you directed by ISIS or inspired by ISIS? Now, I think that gives ISIS too much power. If he was directly directed by ISIS and there's communication to that effect, then you should say ISIS did it. But if he was quote unquote inspired by ISIS, you're giving ISIS too much power to say anyone who does something like this is because of them, and they feel great about that. They get publicity out of that, and they get possibly more fighters and more lone wolf attacks based on that. This now copies a common theme we've unfortunately seen all over Europe now with, look, in France and Germany, truck attacks killed nearly 100 people in 2016. And there was an attack near the Canadian Parliament that was very similar to this a couple of years ago as well. So I hope that our coverage does not encourage these people by making them out to be part of ISIS, like almost playing into ISIS propaganda by saying that they were soldiers or inspired by ISIS.
There's a huge debate on one college campus in California where 3 roommates put out an ad looking for a 4th roommate in their dorm. But they were very specific about how they did not want a white individual to be their roommate. Now, let me give you the details on that. 3 students at the Claremont colleges in Southern California were looking for a 4th this summer to join them in an off-campus house. They added a caveat in parentheses, POC, which means people of color only. They said using a common abbreviation for people of color. Okay. When a classmate challenged that condition, the Pitzer College student who posted the notice on Facebook pushed back, saying it's exclusive because I don't want to live with any white folks. Okay. So these are 3 women who feel that they would be more comfortable with someone who, is a person of color to be the fourth person. I don't know. I don't like that. But I also kind of understand where they're coming from. I don't like self-segregation. I think it's really important to be inclusive. And I think that this kind of starts off with the assumption that just because you're white, you're not going to be, sensitive to their experiences and you're not going to like them or treat them fairly. And I think that's a really unfair outlook on an entire group of people. And I think it's really important to not self-segregate and, be open to a diverse environment. But at the same time, these colleges have gone through a lot of racial tension. Mm-hmm. And so they feel uncomfortable. They feel like they're not being understood. They feel like, the administration at this school hasn't really heard their, grievances. And so I understand that perspective as well. It's a difficult situation.
Well, having played against these colleges, they were in my division when I used to play against them, I can speak firsthand that the teams that I played against weren't the most diverse. Like, because the Pitzer colleges is a group of them. I think there's like 5. It's Claremont, and there's Pomona, and there's Pomona Pitzer. I don't know. They used to all be split. But I can understand if there is this sense of a lack of diversity throughout and some racial tensions. I agree with you. I think that in today's day and age, I am all for inclusivity, and I think that that's going to be one of the keys going forward in trying to bridge the gap that's some people in power are trying to enforce. And the racial tensions are very high at the moment. But that being said, I would never, in my wildest dreams, think about calling this racist, or reverse racism as people are calling it.
After a soccer match earlier this weekend in Turkey, a twin suicide bombing took the lives of 38 people and injured more than 160 others. Officials believe the bombing was the work of the Kurdish terrorist group TAK, an offshoot of the PKK. This is the 19th terrorist incident in Turkey in 2016. In 2015 alone, suicide attacks around the world reportedly killed or injured more than 9,000 civilians. Most suicide bombings target Muslims rather than non-Muslims. Yet, there's this widespread perception of the West that suicide bombings tend to be carried out by Muslims against non-Muslim targets and serve this religious purpose rooted deep within Islamic doctrine. Suicide bombings have been around since the 18th century. But I want to talk about suicide bombings as a tool of modern terrorist warfare and how it became the archetype of Muslim violence. Because while popular culture depicts Muslims as trigger-happy suicide bombers, suicide has always been a cardinal sin in Islam. By contrast, martyrdom, or when Allah decides when you die in battle while protecting your country, is sanctioned in certain verses throughout the Quran. This is where the misinformation comes from, because a frequently cited verse is the Al-Baqarah verse. And say not of those who are killed in the way of Allah, they are dead, nay, they are living, but you perceive it not.
One should defend the realm of Islam and Muslims against heretics and invaders. And to fulfill this duty, one should even sacrifice one's life.
I mentioned this distinction because despite what both Islam's fiercest critics and also the most fervent adherents say, there are no verses in the Quran that explicitly urge Muslims to take their own lives, and many verses that describe suicide as a sin. And the connection between suicide bombings and militant Islamic ideology can be traced back to Iran's Ayatollah Khomeini and the Iran-Iraq war that raged during the 1980s. For the first time ever, Khomeini took this concept of self-sacrifice that was already prominent within Iranians' Shia interpretation of the Quran and extended it to taking one's life for the greater cause of promoting the Iranian revolution. For Khomeini specifically, that also included expanding Islam's role in the war against Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Khomeini picked young boys who were susceptible to indoctrination and marched them through minefields, using their bodies to clear paths for Iranian forces to walk through. He would give these children keys to symbolically represent that they would be unlocking the gates of heaven. This tactic shocked the world. And while many within the Islamic world were horrified, Syrian president at the time, Hafez al-Assad, who's actually the father of the current Syrian president, Bashar al-Assad, saw an opportunity. He then expanded on the idea of using self-sacrifice not only as a means of defense, but also as an offensive weapon when he sent in Shiite suicide bombers behind the wheel of a bus packed with 2,000 pounds of explosives into a US Marine base in Lebanon. The Shiite militants Assad helped assemble eventually became what we know as the Hezbollah. Now, suicide is a sin in Islam. I've mentioned this before. It's a sin in both of the other Abrahamic religions as well, Christianity and Judaism. But these new interpretations, combined with the near constant struggle against what was perceived as occupying forces, created this new reality within the fringes of the Islamic community that glorified suicide. And after Hamas's adoption of this radical interpretation, suicide bombing actually became a tactic employed by the Sunni as well as Shiite militants. And that's when we truly saw the devastating power of suicidal attacks. In the 90s, Hamas started targeting Israeli citizens by strapping explosives made from household items onto women and children and detonating them in public places. Now, this was out of the norm for two reasons. Because the Shia interpretation of the Quran offers some leeway around self-harm to allow for self-sacrifice, but the Sunni interpretation strictly prohibits it. Also, until this point, only occupying combatants were targeted, whereas now civilians were being victimized. Now, Egyptian Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi offers a very unique justification for this.
It's not suicide. It is martyrdom in the name of God. Islamic theologians and jurisprudents have debated this issue. Israeli women are not like women in our society because Israeli women are militarized.
Sunni extremist adoption of suicide bombing that targeted civilians proved critical. Once attacks against civilians could be justified, the words in the Quran no longer meant anything. I don't even know if they meant anything to begin with. But according to a 2012 study published in the National Counterterrorism Center, Sunni extremists account for the greatest number of terrorist attacks and fatalities for the third consecutive year, where more than 5,700 incidents were attributed to Sunni extremists, accounting for nearly 56% of attacks, but most importantly, 70% of all fatalities. Now, this perverted version of Islam appends more than thousands of years of consensus interpretation of the Quran and is now being used to indoctrinate youths in countries crippled by war, in states where citizens have very little access to the basic amenities that many other governments provide. Young people with nowhere else to turn seek answers from these religious leaders, and those religious leaders are not shy about pointing the finger of blame at the Western occupying forces and justifying attacks against fellow Muslims as a means of advancing their own agendas. While power-hungry religious clerics and other Islamic leaders have promoted suicide bombings as a justifiable tool of war, the majority of Muslims condemn it, just like the Quran does. And suicide bombings have always been used to achieve political ends and have nothing to do with waging holy war, no matter what the Western media, Islam's critics, or religious clerics will have you believe. The attack committed by the PKK on Turkish soil is merely the latest example. Religion is simply a recruitment tool targeting the undereducated, the vulnerable, and the disaffected.
A dreamer who attends Arizona State University as a junior decided to make a point about the fact that a lot of undocumented people in this country do contribute to America, and they do so by paying their taxes. So Belen Sisa, who is an immigrant, an undocumented immigrant from Argentina, her family actually brought her to this country when she was 6 years old, posted a photo showing her tax documents and proving that, hey, I actually pay the state of Arizona $300 in taxes. To file my taxes, to pay my taxes. Now keep in mind that she is protected because of Obama's policy to protect dreamers, such as Belen. And what I think is interesting about this story is not that these people pay taxes. Like, we already know that. I think that it's...
Although, Anna, to be fair, almost no one in America knows that.
I know. So, like, whenever I come across stories where people are like, oh, did you know that they actually contribute a lot of money to Social Security, but they never get that benefit? Yeah, I knew that. How about stop watching Fox News? Don't even watch us. Just don't be an idiot and just search for it on the internet, right? It's very easy.
I would like to amend that. Watch us, then search for it.
No, but I know, but people like to look at us and say, oh, they come from a biased point of view, right? But I have no interest in like twisting the facts for you, okay? So if you don't believe me, if you don't believe Cenk, you have all the resources necessary at your fingertips. Take a look at how much undocumented immigrants actually do contribute in the form of taxes.